Thank you for joining us today at Mount Pisgah Church. Bowls of White Hot Passion. We are looking at Revelation 16, but we're kind of going back and we're reassessing some of these passages in the book of Revelation, especially as they tie to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD and to the destruction and removal of the old covenant and the bringing in and firmly establishing the new under the kingship of the Lord Jesus Christ. And we're going to look at some more puzzle pieces today in order to do that. If you're ever in the Mount Pisgah area, we're at 1288 Mount Pisgah Church Road, Apex, North Carolina. We meet at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. And if you have any prayer needs, please feel free to put them down in the comments section below. May the grace and peace of Jesus be yours in fullest measure.
Well, it's an exciting time in so many ways to be alive. For years and years and years, there have been brothers and sisters all over the world, as well as here in our country, praying for God to pour out His Spirit in spiritual awakening and revival. And just this week, there has been interesting reports that are coming out of Kentucky at Asbury Seminary, where a revival actually started back in 1970 and was sort of a precursor or part of what was known as the Jesus movement of the time that spread across the land. This week, during a chapel service there at Asbury Seminary, the Spirit of God began to move in a very powerful way, to the point now where they have had meetings and have been now going, I guess today would be the 8th day. Students have not left the chapel for any length of time. A lot of them have gone and gotten blankets, and they're basically camping out in the chapel. There's prayer, there's confession. People are coming from other places in Kentucky, from other states around, as far away as South Carolina so far. Because there's a crying out that's going on in that place and a movement of God that is starting to take place. And what many believe, and there's pockets of this starting to happen, not only there, but in other places across the United States. And so it could be that we're seeing the precursor of a magnificent and powerful move of the Holy Spirit here in our land. Now, it's going to cause, as every move of the Spirit does, a lot of upheaval. Professors have canceled all their classes. They've not assigned any homework, obviously, to the students. They've canceled their classes. And there are speakers that are coming in, speaking on this various topics that are dealing with the subject of the personal walk with God and holiness and all kinds of things that are going on. The room is just full with people on their knees, students. These are young people who are on their knees crying out to God and pleading with God to do a great work in their own personal hearts and their own lives, as well as in the lives of our country. And this is the way that God advances His kingdom throughout history. There are periods where you have, like we've talked about before, you have this rise and you have a peak. And then there's a leveling off for a period of time, and then there generally is a decline. And then all of a sudden, God intervenes again in history, and there is a rise again. Now, our nation has not experienced this kind of a rise like that in a major way across the land since the late 1800s and maybe the early 1900s. But now there is evidence that there is something happening, and obviously over time things will certainly give evidence as to that being a work of God and how far that work of God will spread. It's also happening in other nations as well around the world right now. And so God advances His kingdom. He thrusts in His sickle. He reaps a harvest for Himself. And then there's time for that harvest as those have been harvested, the time for those to mature, to begin to grow and increase in their walk with God. So keep your, if you're looking at news, if you're on the internet at all, you can type in Asbury Seminary and to kind of keep up with what's going on there at the seminary in Kentucky. And it's, as I said, spreading out various places around the country. And I'm certainly praying that we here at Mount Pisgah, as well as in this area, will not be spared that movement. I pray that God will take notice of the prayers of people here and other places and move in a mighty and powerful way. Wouldn't it be a beautiful thing to see this auditorium filled with people? Not just for the standpoint of thinking, just for the survival or future of the church, but people actually hungry for God. People who are hungry for Jesus and to see Him move in great and mighty power in their lives. Go back to Revelation 16 this morning. This is a second part to what we began last week about these bowls of white hot passion. And we saw that we're putting together a puzzle. Because remember, as we talked about so many weeks ago, the book of Revelation is like an onion, and there are so many different layers to it of meaning and significance. Now, as we talked about when we saw the picture of the little lamb a few weeks ago, there is a fundamental primary meaning and interpretation to the letter. The fundamental primary significance of it, given to those people in the first century with a specific message to those specific people that dealt with their specific time. And it was a message filled, as we'll see in a moment, with all kinds of signs and symbols, but it was relatable to them, and it was for them, primary, first and foremost, for them. It was what Bible scholars call an occasional letter, meaning that it was written due to an occasion of a special significance to that group of people. Just like when Paul wrote to the Corinthians, it was an occasional letter because they had problems going on in that church, and so Paul had to address those issues and those problems. Not that that letter was ever meant for anybody else in Asia Minor at that time. It was meant for the Corinthians first and foremost. Yet, today, we still glean stuff from the letter to the Corinthians, don't we? Truths and things, because there's layers to it. Same thing is true of Revelation. First and foremost, there's a fundamental meaning to it, to the people that it was sent to, and the significance for those people and that time. And as we said, primarily, we're going to see this even more, the significance of this letter had to do with a number of things, primarily the destruction of the old system, ultimately, first and foremost, finally, the old covenant, everything being destroyed with the destruction of Jerusalem. The prophecies in this letter had to do primarily with the destruction of Jerusalem and the coming of the invasion of Rome into the land to destroy the temple, to destroy Jerusalem, and the firm establishing of the new covenant. But we also know there's layers of meaning, and we'll see that for us today. Just it's relevant for us today, as Jesus promised that it would be, with principles and truths. And the latter part of the letter, from about midway through chapter 20 on to chapter 22, has significant reference to the future and what is yet to come for all of creation. And as we saw that in verse 1 of chapter 16, the angel, John hears a loud voice from the temple or the sanctuary in heaven, saying to the seven angels, the seven messengers, to go and pour out on the earth the seven bowls of the wrath of God. And remember, this is a big thing, and this is something that, quite frankly, when I started working through this, overlooked that as I was looking. But the word earth there literally means land. Pour out the bowls of wrath upon the land. And the significance of land for a Jew had one primary meaning, right? John understood the land. Every Jew understood the land, and it had to do with the nation of Israel. Now, these bowls are going to be poured out upon the land. Now, last week, my wife, she loves to put puzzles together. And just this morning, she had gotten some puzzles yesterday, and she's got a huge one that she got yesterday. And she normally has a system to put that puzzle together. She always begins to start with the outside to give it a framework. then begins to build from that to the inside. Now, this morning she got it, we were up, she was talking, she said, I made a mistake. I said, what did you do? She said, I started with some puzzle pieces on the inside rather than setting up the framework from the outside. So she said it might make a little bit more difficult. And ultimately, you get a complete picture. Once those pieces are all connected together, you see a final completed picture. Now, as long as those pieces are scattered all over the table, you don't see the picture. You know that they fit in there, but you're not exactly sure where and how. But if you have a framework to go by, what she does, she's got a box cover. This is what this is supposed to look like. This is the meaning of all these pieces right here. This is it. Now, you get the pieces and you put them into place till you ultimately get the picture. This is what Revelation is. It is a puzzle. And you have to have a framework to work from. And Jesus gives us a lot of indications when he talks to John and he says, look, here's the overall picture. This puzzle is supposed to look like this. It has to do with the destruction of the old system, Jerusalem, the temple, and the establishing firmly of the new. It is the revelation of me as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, as the glorious and mighty God, the head of the new creation and the new covenant. That's what the picture is going to look like. Now, as we go through this letter, John, there's going to be a lot of different puzzle pieces. And we've got to start by putting the outside edges together so everything begins to fit. And so as we started last week looking, okay, if the first and foremost primary meaning has to do with the judgment of the land and of Israel and of Jerusalem and of the temple particularly, and the system of that old system being done, and it being the revelation of Jesus as the Lord, the King of all, and the head of the new covenant, we put those outer pieces together, and then the chapters all the way between chapter 1 and chapter 22, there's different pieces that are being put together in this puzzle. We saw that the backdrop for all that last week, the time and the dating of the letter. That now I fully believe and am convinced that this letter, due to the different sources, are and was written by John, obviously, but prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. It was written somewhere around 65 to 66 AD. He was in Patmos. Either he was there for one of two reasons. He was either there under banishment, but there are others who say he was there for the cause of Christ. He was there witnessing for the gospel. And in that place, while he was there bringing the message of the gospel, Jesus encountered him. Piece of the puzzle we saw last week as well. The writer of Hebrews tells us the new covenant has been established. The old now is obsolete. It's fading away. That's what the whole book of Hebrews is all about. That the old priesthood, the old temple sacrifices, the old temple worship, the sacrifices themselves, the temple itself, and the covenant itself, he says, is obsolete. They're all done with, and they are being removed. Paul gave us that same principle as we saw in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. The fading out of the old glory and the establishing of the new with the new covenant. We also saw puzzle piece number 3, that Jesus gave warnings to his generation in Matthew 23, 24, and 25, Luke 21, Mark 13, and John chapter 2. He gave them warnings of what was coming to Jerusalem and its destruction and the fading and removal of the old system. And he gave them many, many woes, and he is coming in judgment. He would come in judgment on that old system. We also saw another puzzle piece, Babylon, which is going to be significant in the next several chapters. Babylon represents what city? Jerusalem. We saw that very clearly. John tells us that. It represents the Jerusalem which was now in existence. In 4 different ways, conclusions were drawn from statements that were made in the Revelation that the Babylon that we see in the book of Revelation is Jerusalem. We also saw the mark of the beast. What was the mark of the beast? The mark of the beast, as we saw, that charagma. It had to do with the coinage and the engraving of Caesar's head on the coinage, which the Jews refused to use because Caesar declared himself to be who? God. And using that coinage would be an acknowledgement of that fact. And so believers as well and Jews, they would not use that coinage, but also you had to use that coinage to enter into the marketplace to buy and sell. Without it, you could not. And you also had to sprinkle incense to recognize and acknowledge Caesar is Lord, Caesar is God, to get into the marketplace. And many times they would take the ash from your offering of the incense and put it on your hand or your forehead to show that you had offered incense, so you had legal right to enter into the marketplace. These guys understood that when they got it. We also saw who the beast was. We saw the significance that John gave that to the believers in code, and he tells them very clearly in the Hebrew language as well as in the Greek, because each letter has a numeric code assigned to it, 666, spelled Caesar Nero. He couldn't put that out plainly because it would have gotten a lot of people in trouble. He had to write in code. And so John told them, they understood this is the beast. They understood who the false prophet was, the religious system of Rome, enforcing people to worship the beast, to honor Caesar as deity and as divine. So as we put a few more puzzle pieces together this morning, we have to see this. We got to remember, very, very important to remember, that the revelation of Jesus Christ is all about Jesus Christ. It's all about him in his past, his present, and his future interactions and his dealings and involvement with humans and humanity, as well as spiritual beings in both the seen and the unseen realm. It's all about that, and we see that throughout this letter. Another thing this letter is not about, and we'll clear that up real quick now, and John will clear it up for us. This letter is not about an singular antichrist and some future figure from John's day, 2,000, 3,000 years in the future, removed, coming on the scene to rule the world. How do we know that? Because John specifically tells us that. Look back, if you will, in John's first letter, in 1 John. Chapter 2. And it's amazing. And again, we're all affected by this in one degree to another. When we are growing up in church, we're handed, most of the time, a belief system, a theology about different things. For a lot of us in here, because we grew up at the time we've grown up, and because the church we've grown up into, we were handed a belief system about the rapture, about the second coming of Jesus and all of that, and about an antichrist. So because of that, whenever we read the term antichrist, which that term is not found in Revelation, obviously, but whenever we read the term antichrist, because we were handed some glasses by our belief system to interpret that through, we automatically think future person at the end of time, right? That's because that's what we were given. But John tells us, no, that's not what this is all about. In the second chapter of 1 John, when he's writing to these brothers and sisters, notice what he says in verse 18. He says, children, now notice what he says. It is now the last hour. It is the last hour now. It is time. And he says, and just as you heard that Antichrist is coming, you've been thinking, he says, you've heard singular Antichrist is coming. But I'm going to tell you something different. He says, even now, many Antichrists have appeared. From this we know it is the last hour. You're not looking, John's telling them, you're not looking for one person. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of antichrists who have appeared. Anti-messiahs, one who tries to stand alongside and it's a false Christ, which Jesus warned of. Then down in verse 22, notice what he says. This is how you know who these people are. Who is the liar? But the one who denies that Jesus is the Messiah. This is the Antichrist. The one who denies the Father and the Son. There's many of them. And how do you know them? They deny that Jesus is who he says he is. They deny the relationship between the Father and the Son. They are deniers of Jesus being the Messiah. That's how you know a person's an antichrist. Because they deny the Father and the Son, and there are many of them. Then down in the 4th chapter of that same letter, he says this in verse 2. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. Every spirit that does not confess Jesus, coming in the flesh is what he's inferring, is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist. This is the spirit of an Antichrist, of which you have heard is coming and is now already in the world. He says, this is how you know. They've denied that Jesus is the Christ. They don't confess Jesus. They deny him. They deny his deity. This spirit, this person, these persons are already here. Already. In my time, your time, he's saying, right here and now. And then if you go a couple of pages over to the second little letter of John, just one simple chapter, he says in verse 7 of that one chapter, he says, for many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ is coming in the flesh. This is the deceiver and the Antichrist. This is it. He's not talking about something way down the road. So Revelation has nothing to do and is not about Antichrist and some future world ruler at all. John says they're already here. The Spirit is already here. There's many of them. So when he's writing Revelation, he's not focusing on an Antichrist. The only time and we immediately, again, because of our system we grow up in, we go to chapter 13 and we read beast and we say Antichrist. John doesn't say that. He calls it a beast. And it's described as a physical beast, a weird creature. That's what it's looking at. But again, we automatically assume, it's an Antichrist somewhere in the future because of what we've been handed to believe. But John says, no. There's already a whole bunch of them 2,000 years ago. And how do you know them? They deny Jesus. They deny who he is and that he came in the flesh and that he's one with the Father. Another third piece of a puzzle here that we need is to remember that John, when he saw Jesus in chapter 1, he did not see him as he had originally known him, did he? Remember, he knew him for 3.5 years really well. He was beloved by Jesus, the one that Jesus greatly loved. They spent a lot of time around campfires together. They fished together. They walked through the hills and mountains of Judea together. He heard him teach and all of that. But when John saw Jesus, he didn't see him that way because Jesus doesn't look that way anymore. There was a familiarity, yes. But now when John sees Jesus at the end of Revelation 1, again in symbolic terms, now he sees Jesus as the glorified, the majestic, the royal king and God, to whom all authority and power in heaven and earth belongs to him. He has all authority in all places, at all times, everywhere, and in every realm. He was that then to John. He is still that now today. And he will be that forever. When we see Jesus physically, when we meet him face to face, we're not going to see him as the way he looked in the year AD 28, 29, and 30. It ain't going to be that way. We're going to see a glorified, majestic, royal, mighty king. A king that the whole universe trembles at in his presence because of his majesty and how powerful he is. One that when John saw him, it says he fell at his feet as a dead man. He could not stand in his presence. A different looking Jesus, still the same in his character and his nature. As the writer of Hebrews says, Jesus Christ the same yesterday, today, and forever. But when the writer wrote that, he wasn't talking about his appearance. He was talking about his nature, his essence, his character. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. John sees him. But through Revelation, we see pictures of Jesus. And again, they're all symbolic, but that show us different aspects of his character and nature. In Revelation 5, we see him as a lamb who had been slain, but with perfect power and perfect wisdom. Then as we move through, we go to chapter 10, and we see Jesus as this mighty angel standing upon the land, Israel, and upon the sea of all the nations, with a rainbow around his head. This great and mighty, powerful God. Then you go to 14, and you see him as a angelic being, which many believe, harvesting, one who has the authority to harvest and reap a harvest in the earth. You go to chapter 19, you see him as a rider on a white horse, leading the armies of heaven as the commander-in-chief, as the general, as the great warrior who is leading them out in a mighty battle. In chapter 20, you see him on a great white throne as the judge of all creation, from whom the heavens and the earth flee away and run away from his presence. They can't stand there. And then in Revelation 22, you see him as the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning, the end, the first and the last. We see a lot of different pictures of Jesus. Another piece of the puzzle that we have to remember is that Revelation is given to us, as we have emphasized all through this letter, in symbolic, figurative language to describe and to reveal to us actual physical events or spiritual realities or events. That's what it's given to us in. And we have to understand that. None of this is to be taken literally. There's not literally a dragon running around in heaven. There's not literally a lamb with weird-looking eyes, 7 eyes and 7 horns on him. All these things are symbols and pictures that are describing spiritual realities. It's like giving a little kid, word pictures to understand adult kinds of things. And one of the reasons why, and this is an important piece of this puzzle, we know that this letter has immediate significance for the people that it was written to, is because Jesus gives a specific time code as to the prophecies in this book. He himself gives that time code. Revelation 1, let's look there, very immediate, very first one that he gives to us. In Revelation 1, verse 1, he says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him, Jesus, to show his bondservants or slaves, the things which must, what? Shortly, soon come to pass or take place. That's a time code, folks. He says, the things that you're getting ready to be shown, John, are getting ready to happen. They're soon to happen. Now, again, does it make sense for Jesus to use terminology that says these things are soon getting ready to happen, and it has something to do with 2,000 or 3,000 years later? Wouldn't matter to those people, would it? Not at all. Remember, first layer is to them. This is for you because this stuff that I'm getting ready to show you is getting ready to happen. It's getting ready to take place. The time is at hand. It's right immediately here at the door. The same thing is he starts the letter, very first verse, with that timestamp, and then he closes the letter in the same way in chapter 22 and verse 6. He's finished now. John's seen everything that Jesus wanted to show him in the Revelation. And so he's closing out the letter after seeing the new heavens and the new earth. In verse 6, he says, he said to me, these words are faithful and true. And the Lord, the God of the spirits of the prophets, sent his angel to show his bondservants the things which must soon take place. They are at the door right now. This whole idea, this soon come to pass, And here's the thing. The term in the Greek language that John's writing in for soon or near or shortly coming to pass, it is a term that meant, and it was a common term used every day, people would understand it, it meant near in time. It's the same kind of terminology that Jesus used when he talked about, and John was writing about, the Passover was near at hand. It was just a few days away when he wrote that. Or when Jesus was given the parable of the fig tree, and he said, when you see these things, you know that summer is near. It's coming. You're in the spring, so you know that summer's at the door. It's not 1,000 years away. It's right here at the door. And then it was used to refer the same way to a festival that the Jews celebrated. The festival of the Jews was at hand, it says. That means it's near. Not 100 years away, not 200 years away. It's right there. It's one of the most common everyday terms used to refer to temporal closeness. It's right here. So when Jesus says, these things must soon take place, these are things that are soon to come to pass, it was at hand. And specifically in verse 3, in chapter 1, we saw that those who read the letter were to obey it. They were to obey what was told to them in this letter because it was significant for that first layer of people specifically. There were things they had to obey. They had to trust God in because he was making some promises to them about some certain things that were getting ready to happen and that they could bank on, they could trust in and rely on him for, and they were to obey him. Another piece of the puzzle is the fact that when we go through this letter, and we'll see this next week, when I'm going to take all these pieces up to chapter 16 and put them in. And you're going to go, oh my goodness, that makes just perfect sense. It just makes perfect sense. It's clear as day now. Jesus' revelation has been fulfilled in many ways. Because the things were at hand. They were immediate. They were getting ready to happen. Daniel refers to this time in Daniel 12, as well as in Daniel 7 and 9, as the time of the end. He specifically says, he refers to the time of Jerusalem's destruction, the power of the holy people being shattered, and the temple being destroyed, and the abomination of desolation being set up on the wing of the temple. He refers to it as the end of time. It's the end of time. What he's saying is it's the end of an age. The age of the old covenant. The age of the old system. It's over. It's done. New has established. It's been introduced. Daniel refers to this. Jesus specifically said, as we saw last week, these things will be seen by this generation, the one he was talking to. Most of these people, most of you guys, you're not going to die. You're going to see this happen. And I'm telling you about it 40 years before it happens. It's going to happen. And this generation will not pass away, he says, until everything I've just told you is fulfilled. It is at hand. It is taking place. It would be the judgment that would take place upon Israel in the old system and the changing over firmly and finally of the covenant system from the old to the new. The relief, as we said last week, of persecution would be given to those believers because their primary source of persecution was the Jewish system, the leaders of it, the synagogue, the leaders of the synagogue. Now, again, as I said last week, they used Rome to do it, but they were the source of it, and this is mentioned in Revelation 2 and 3. In many of these churches, that was where they were getting the source of their problem from, and God is saying, I'm getting ready to end that. It's getting ready to be over with. And you will have some relief from that source of persecution. But there's a meaning for them, but we have repeated patterns, again, that we can look at that glean for us, right? I mean, wherever there's people being persecuted today, we glean from Revelation, God knows it. God cares. God will deal with those who persecute them. He will give the people grace and sustenance and supply in the midst of their persecution. They have the opportunity to bear witness. How do they overcome? They overcome by the blood of the Lamb, the word of their testimony, not loving their life to the death. That's all significant for people today. Wherever a system like Babylon shows up, any worldly system, through any worldly empire in history, we know how God feels about that, don't we? By seeing how he feels about it here. It's a principle. He always will judge Babylon. He always will. Judgment will always come upon a Babylon because that's how God feels about that. The promises he makes to his people in Revelation are promises that we can hold on to as well. Jesus stands at the door and knocks. If any man hears his voice and opens the door, he will come into them and sup with them, and they with him. They will have a meal, fellowship. That principle, even though it had a principle primary meaning for those people in the first century, we glean from that too today, don't we? It's a promise we can hold on to, and we, many of us, have experienced in our own personal life. There's patterns and histories that we see in Revelation that are repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated throughout history. But what we're reminded of is that through it all, Jesus sits and is in the position of all authority, right? Over it all. Over it all. He is in the position of ultimate authority and power, and Revelation teaches us that. Now, here's another really important piece, and this is going to kind of rattle us a little bit. God and Jesus have many of these in history. Many comings. Those comings are primarily, and we see this in the Old Testament, a coming in judgment. Now we know that they're ultimately at a point in history, somewhere in the future, we don't know when, is going to be the second coming of Jesus. As was his first coming, he will return in the flesh. He will establish his kingdom for all the ages to come. That is going to happen. But even between now and then, there are going to be comings of Jesus. Most of the comings that we see in the scripture referring to God coming or Jesus coming are acts of God carrying out judgment upon many peoples and nations. So when we talk about coming and the coming of Jesus, we need to be specific. Well, in the context of what's being written, what coming is the writer referring to? What is he talking about? How do we know this? Because the Old Testament, which Revelation is built upon, remember, is filled with this kind of language in the Psalms, in the prophets. Here's one example of that. Look, if you will, in Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, chapter 19. This has to do with God's coming and judgment on Egypt. In Isaiah chapter 19. And if you're a Jew, again, you're a Jewish believer, and you're reading statements like this, you already have a connection with this stuff in the Old Testament. It makes sense to you because you've read it. You understand that when he says he's coming, that it probably has to do in some sense, in some relationship to, especially in the context of how it's written, judgment. And that when he does come, you're not physically, visibly going to see him, but you're going to see the result of that action. In Isaiah chapter 19, verse 1, the oracle concerning Egypt. Behold, the Lord is riding or coming on a swift cloud and is about to come to Egypt. And the rest of that chapter deals with how God is going to judge Egypt. Now, do you think the Egyptians, when that started happening, went outside and they saw God riding on a cloud, coming to Egypt, bringing judgment on them? No. But that's the language that is used. The psalmist talks about God riding on the clouds and coming on the clouds of heaven in the different ways in which he judged the nations around Israel. So again, remember, we are given lenses as we're growing up as kids, and when we reread coming as it refers to Jesus, our mind automatically associates that with one, either a rapture at some point or the second coming. But for the Jews, even in the first century, that terminology meant many things to them. And specifically, as you look through the New Testament, Jesus had specifically made a statement about his coming and his coming in judgment and his coming in judgment on the land and on the temple. And they were looking for that coming. They were anticipating it because he said it would happen in that generation. Why do we know that? Look in Matthew 26. Jesus is getting ready to be crucified. He's being tried before the high priests and all these guys. They're trying him and they're questioning him. And you will notice what Jesus says to them when they ask him some, questions. They talked about the statement he had made, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up. They're questioning him about that. These people are testifying against Christ. In verse 62 of Matthew chapter 26, he says, the high priest stood up and said to him, do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you? Jesus kept silent. The high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Messiah, the Son of God. And Jesus said to him, you've said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. You will see this. Notice what he said. Caiaphas, Annas, you will see this. He didn't say, oh, wait, yonder in the future this is going to happen. He says, hereafter, there's going to be a place where I'm sitting and I'm going to be coming and you guys are going to see this. And he'd already declared this to his disciples in Matthew 24, that he would come in the clouds of heaven and associated it with the judgment of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. You're going to see me coming, Caiaphas. What was Jesus saying? They're physically, visibly going to see Jesus in the clouds coming in the sky? No. It was a symbolic term that they could associate with God's coming in judgment upon a people throughout the Old Testament. Look in Revelation 1:7. This is repeated by John in Revelation 1:7. Remember, John, he'd heard all of these things from Jesus. And again, for John, a lot of the stuff that Jesus taught were pieces of the puzzle that boom, boom, boom started coming together. Started making sense now as time moved forward. And ultimately, when the destruction of Jerusalem happened, John could stand back and he could look back and say, holy cow, that's what he meant. Exactly what he meant. And it happened just exactly as he said it would. Revelation 1:7, behold, he is coming with the clouds. Every eye will see him. Who's going to see him? Those who did what to him? Pierced him. And all the tribes of the land will mourn over him. So it is to be. Amen. Now here's the thing. Behold, look, he is coming. Do you know the tense of that word is interesting, the word coming? If we were to say it in English, the only way we could say it to communicate to somebody when I say, behold, Kenny is coming, which means, behold, Kenny is coming continuously, presently, repeatedly, habitually, progressively, he's coming with the clouds. That would be the only way I could describe it to you, the way it was written in the original language here. So when John writes that, what he's saying is, look, Jesus is coming continuously. He's coming continuously. He's come to Asbury Seminary this week in a visible way. He's shown up in a visible way, and the evidence of that, even though they don't physically see him, are the lives that are being transformed and changed by his power. He's coming continuously, presently, right now, repeatedly. He repeats these kinds of comings through history. Habitually, it is his habit to come and do the things that he does. Progressively, every coming in history is ultimately leading toward an ultimate and finality to the coming when he visibly, physically returns to the earth. But notice he says he's coming, and every eye, the eyes of those who pierced him. That was clear again as day to those people, because the generation that killed Jesus, remember when they crucified him, they said, let his blood be on us and our children. We have no king but Caesar. When Peter stood up, he said, you murdered, you're guilty. Stephen said, you're guilty. It was Jews. They were guilty of that. They were the ones that pierced him. And Jesus says, those who pierced him will see him coming, and they who dwell in the land will mourn. They will weep and they will wail. Why? Because as he comes, he is coming in judgment upon the land of Israel. And the woe that is coming upon that land will send them weeping and wailing and crying. They will know. The angels, when they stood with the disciples in Acts 1, and it says that Jesus ascended back to heaven, they said, why are you standing here gazing up into the heavens, guys? This same Jesus that you saw leave will so come in like manner. It's interesting. The word come there means periodically. He's going to be coming periodically. He's not gone. He showed up 40 days later at Pentecost by his Spirit. He came to Paul in a prison. He came to Peter in a vision. He's coming. He's going to come ultimately, surely, and finally one day, but he will be coming throughout history in many ways in times of judgment. Another piece of the puzzle is that in Revelation, there are a series of contrasts. Very interesting. In Revelation, there are two cities that are tied together and contrasted. The Jerusalem in this world, the old one, and the New Jerusalem. Old Jerusalem, New Jerusalem. Old Jerusalem's tied to the what? Old Covenant. New Jerusalem is the New Covenant. You have two women in Revelation. You have a harlot, which is the religious system of the Old Covenant that's been perverted and corrupted, and we'll see that as we get in chapter 17. And the bride of Christ. Two women. You have two beasts that are shown, obviously, Caesar, Nero, the ruler of the empire at that time, and his religious cohort that enforced the worship of Caesar. You also have two temples. You have a temple of earthly Jerusalem, a tabernacle and temple of earthly Jerusalem in Revelation 11. And this is what is amazing. Think about this. John was told to go and measure the temple. That meant the temple was still standing. If Revelation had been written in the mid-90s, there was no temple standing. He said, go measure the temple. There's the earthly temple, and there is the heavenly temple that's mentioned. Two contrasting temples, two contrasting systems, two contrasting covenants, old and new. And there's two scrolls that's actually one scroll. The scroll that Jesus has and is handed in Revelation 5, which is very interesting, because many believe that okay, when we talked about it, we talked about the various different interpretations of what that scroll is, but we know one thing definitely that's in that scroll are the woes and the judgments that come throughout the rest of the book, right? We know that. It's loosed by Jesus. What many believe, which I'm leaning heavily more toward this, is that scroll is actually God's bill of divorcement to the nation of Israel that he spoke of through the prophets because they had forsaken him. And the enforcement of the judgments of the old covenant, warning them, as he said, in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy 28, 29, 30, and 31, and 32. These are the things that are going to happen to you if you forsake me. And all of the things that he says, all of the curses and judgments that are enforced in Revelation are written about in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy. Every one of them. And that Jesus is loosing this and he's saying, the old is done. The relationship is over. Now, if you want a relationship with me, you come through who? Messiah. You come through the new covenant. Because that old covenant is obliterated. It's over with. And John is then handed that scroll, and he eats it. This isn't a new scroll that John is handed. That same scroll he's handed to, and he says, okay, John, now you eat that scroll. When you eat it, it's going to be sweet as honey in your mouth because it's the word of God. But when it gets into your belly, it's going to be bitter. Why is it bitter? Because of the judgments that it's talking about against the land. And the prophecies that you have to prophesy now for many peoples, nations, tribes that are tied in with all of this as you move forward. See, there's contrasts all in here. So what do we glean from this? Well, our king, as I said a while ago, rules over everything. He rules over everything. He's ruling over Russia. He's ruling over China. He's ruling over the United States. He's overseen and over even the wars, the tragedies, the things that are transpiring and taking place in this world right now. He's king. None of it surprises him. None of it is upsetting him. There are lots that's grieving him, obviously, in the lives of people who are being tragically wounded, hurt, destroyed, killed, the way that sin is ravaging so many people's lives. But he is king over everything that's happening in a macro sense and in a micro sense in my life and in yours. He's king. And nothing can change that. Nothing. You have to see him, not a sweet Jesus, gentle, meek, and mild, who lived AD 27 to AD 30, that image we have of him. You have to see him the way Paul and John saw him. Because remember, Paul said, I don't know him after the flesh. I only know what I've seen. And Paul saw the glorified Messiah. We have to see him that way. And when you get a vision of him like that, that totally transforms the way you have your perspective on the world and everything going on around you. You realize he's not impotent, he is omnipotent over it all. He rules over all. 2, he keeps his word. He told these people this is exactly what's going to happen. To the letter. To the day. He even said it to the day in Daniel. 1,290 days are going to go to pass, and this is what's going to happen. And blessed is he who comes to the 1,335th day. And those who came to that 1,335th day after the sacking of Jerusalem and destruction of the temple were blessed. They survived it. Just exactly like he said they would. He keeps his word and he keeps his promises to us. 3, you and I, we don't live in fear of the future. We don't have to be afraid of whatever happens. And we are not to allow ourselves to be manipulated by fear by anybody. By anybody. How many times have we heard people who talk about prophecy use things in Revelation to make people afraid? My daughter this week, when we were talking to her, she said, I can remember watching those movies growing up and how I was so scared. Fear, God does not motivate and work through fear. Love does not use fear to control you. And we don't have to be afraid. This is why Jesus said, don't be afraid. Fear not. I'm in charge. Trust me. With whatever's happening in the world, you don't have to be afraid. The principles that you see in Revelation apply today. They're applicable for those first century people, but they're also principles that you can glean from and I still hold for and keep in your life today. And finally, we need to be shed in our own lives as God's children of the old covenant. The old covenant ways and cling solely to the new covenant. And the one law Jesus has given us in the new covenant. What's that law? Love. Love as I have loved you. Everything flows from that. Everything flows from that. You live by that law, that commandment. But today, how many people have taken, we're in the new covenant, but we go back and we cherry pick from the old covenant and we try to bring these things into our life today, and they have nothing to do with us. None. In the charismatic movement, the health and wealth gospel, do you know what they're claiming? All these blessings will come upon you. And they go back to Deuteronomy 28 and they claim all the blessings of the old covenant. And then they say, oh, but if you don't believe and you don't trust, all these curses are going to come upon you. You're cursed, you're cursed, you're cursed. That's a bunch of scoobala. They're cherry picking. None of that has anything to do with a new covenant believer. None of it. You cannot claim that it does. It had to do with one people, one nation, and what the nation's name? Israel. That's who the covenant was with, not you and me. And all these cute little cards that we go to the store and we see these Old Testament, promises. I know the plans and the thoughts that I have for you, thoughts to prosper you, thoughts to bless you, and all that kind of stuff. Well, guess what? That does not apply to you unless you're a Jew living in Israel and getting ready to go into captivity, and God going to bring you out of that captivity and bring you back to land, because the context of that promise is in the context of a greater statement to Israel. We're in a new covenant now, new promises. We don't go back to that and pull from those kinds of things and then try to add them to this. Remember, new wine does not go into old wineskins because it bursts. And how many people's lives are bursting? Confused, downtrodden, because they're not living under the reality of the new covenant. They're still trying to bring remnants from the old. Like Lazarus, they haven't had the grave clothes taken off of them. They're still dragging around some rags from the tomb. And they need to be loosed and let go, set free. Those are some pieces of the puzzle. Now next week, I'm going to throw all these pieces together. You've got an outside lining. And up to chapter 16, you're going to go, wow. Perfect sense. Make sense to you? All right. Father, thank you for your goodness and mercy. Thank you for your grace. Thank you for the promises that you have made to us and that you keep. And thank you, Lord Jesus, that this morning you sit as king over all. Thank you for your promised comings in blessing, in revival, in spiritual awakening, even in judgment, because your judgments ultimately lead to restoration. You're so good. And we pray that you'll just continue to give us insight and to live as free believers under this wonderful new covenant that you have given to us. In your name we pray. Amen.